Character. The moral values and habits of an individual is in the spotlight now more than perhaps at any other point in modern history. What is the role of character in successful leadership? And how do you build it in individuals and prospective leaders? Those questions are addressed in a wonderful new book titled The Character Edge, Leading and Winning with Integrity. And with us now are its co-authors, General Robert Caslen, the 59th Superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point, who is now serving as the president of the University of South Carolina, and Dr. Michael Matthews, professor of engineering psychology at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. I'd like to welcome you both to the business again.
Glad to be here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you, Denver.
Let me start with you, Mike, by asking, what is character?
Well, you gave a good definition, Denver, right at the top. I think you may have pulled that right out of our first chapter, maybe. But I just say it is these enduring and consistent behaviors, beliefs, and actions and values that characterize a person's approach to the world. And they can be things like performance character, things that help you do better, like grit and determination and self-regulation. But there's also the type of character attributes that have to do with your values as a human being, strengths of humanity, fairness, justice, and things of that nature, truth and honesty. And you can probably break it down some other ways, but an idea I'd like to get across to everybody is that character is not just one little thing. It's not just honesty or not just grit or self-regulation. There's a couple of dozen, perhaps, different aspects of, or things that can be thought of as character traits in people, positive character traits.
Yeah, and psychologists, they've identified what they call the big three factors in shaping character. What would those be?
Well, so education is very important. Leadership capabilities, experiences, like we try to do this at West Point, and then skill building curricula. So a very important piece of trust, which we think is a critical component of leadership, is competence. So you build skills, you build competence. As you build competence, you build confidence. And that interacts then with the ability to leverage positive character traits like integrity in that leadership context to have a person who can be not just good at their job, but who can be trusted to lead you in the right way.
Yeah. Building leaders of character, Bob, became your passion while serving as the superintendent. West Point has touted three basic goals for cadet development: academic, military, and physical fitness. Why did you believe it was so important to add character development as the fourth component?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Denver. Building leaders of character was right in our mission statement because we felt it was so important. We do have military development, academic development, and physical development. Our mission statement says that we educate, train, and inspire leaders of character. You'll notice, though, it doesn't say that you educate, train, and inspire leaders who are intellectually adept or physically adept. It says you educate, train, inspire leaders of character. And the reason is simple. Because you could be number one in your class academically, but if you fail in character, you have failed in leadership. The most important element in effective leadership is trust. And the best way to gain trust or to lose trust is to be a man and woman of character or no character. So you can be number one academically, and if you fail in character, you failed in leadership because you lost trust. It's simple as that. So building leaders of character at West Point became the most important thing that we were doing.
Yeah, and it was all codified in West Point's leader development system. Tell us about that program and the 5 character attributes needed to be an effective leader.
Yeah, the leadership development system was really designed on not only developing the values and attributes of effective leadership, but also to develop the person to be an effective member of a team. To be able to lead teams and to build teams and to be a member of the teams, and also to learn how to be a follower within a team because you're working for somebody else. But the attributes, the individual attributes of the leadership development were tremendously important, and the character aspects were a piece of that. The character aspects were really defined by our values that we had at West Point, values of duty and honor and country. And the Army had its own set of values, which was loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. And we pulled those values, and those are the values that we taught. Those are the values we wanted to be internalized through educational and experiential opportunities. And those are the ones that they were successful, and in some cases they failed at. And we didn't look at failure as something that was permanent. We looked at failure as an opportunity to grow and to learn and to get stronger and to develop. And that how we reacted when there was a failure was an important part of that leadership development program as well.
Yeah, such a healthy perspective. Mike, is there much or even any character education going on in our schools? And is there a desire for it?
I think there needs to be more. And I think a growing awareness. And what I think excites me about that is that what we've done at West Point, where we have very systematically integrated character education into our general curriculum. So for example, every cadet takes general psychology for leaders their first year at West Point. And in that course, there's explicit instruction of the psychology of character. They get to practice that as leaders and followers. And then in their junior year, they take a course called military leadership. The first 2 or 3 lessons completely devoted to character, but it's a course on leadership. So that's infused throughout that. In their senior year, they get another course, and along the way, I won't take too much time this. I could do this in our whole 35 minutes describing this. Many, many opportunities to practice in the field what they learn in the classroom. Now, the reason I bring that up, I think it becomes what West Point does on our scale for 18 to 23 or 24-year-olds can be an inspirational model for what K through 12 might do. Yeah. So for instance, there are 2 West Point graduates who have developed character education programs for K through 12. One, he's a lieutenant colonel in the reserves now, Mike Irwin, is doing this thing through something called the Positivity Project. And he's got more customers than he can actually fulfill in terms of schools that are interested in character education.
There's a demand.
It's big. And another one of our recent cadets graduated, I believe in 2012 or so, I think Bob might remember the exact date, Danny Wang, now lives in Hanoi and started up a very similar enterprise in Southeast Asia with probably the same goals to imbue the youth of Vietnam, and he's now branched out even to Thailand and elsewhere in that region, explicit curricula designed to help teachers achieve that goal.
After the formative years, Mike, is it possible to alter one's character, or is it pretty well set? In other words, is it too late for me?
Well, that's something that pointy-headed scientists argue in very arcane ways. So I remember there being this discussion in the literature of psychology. If honesty is a trait, is it something that's specific to that individual? How etched in stone by the time you're 18 or 19?
Yeah.
And then how much of it is situational? In other words, are you honest as a general characteristic across all situations, or is it brought out more or less so in different situations? But I think the emerging data from character science suggests that we can change our character in desirable ways throughout the lifespan. Maybe Bob would comment on this as well, but I think sometimes it requires a triggering event. Sometimes those triggering events can be aversive things like the pandemic or a cancer diagnosis or something that really forces you to sort of look inward at your values and reassess who you are and the kind of person you want to be.
If I could jump in, Denver.
Yeah, please do.
Mike has suggested. I think that when you are faced with some kind of confrontation, your reaction really is the manifestation of the character that you have and the values that you've internalized. Said another way, if I'm holding a cup of coffee that's filled to the top and someone hits my arm, whether I want to or not, what's inside that cup of coffee is going to spill out. So if I'm in a situation and I'm confronted, and my natural reaction is really the manifestation of those values I've internalized. You may like those values or you may not like those values, but those values really illustrate what your character is like. Yeah. And if you do not like the values of how you react in that situation, then yes, I really believe you can change your character. You can study about it. You can put yourself in experiential means. You can reflect and have introspection on what you really need to do and how you need to modify that so that when you're confronted with that situation again, you have learned. And through that experiential event, you have become better and stronger as a result.
Yeah, it's really embedded in the DNA is because there's that reaction without even thinking is how you respond. You know, in the book, you talk about strength of the gut, the heart, and the head. And I want to touch on each of those if we could, starting with the head. And Bob, this might be best illustrated through the story you tell of the dilapidated tomato paste factory in Iraq. Tell us that story and some of the takeaways from it.
Yeah, so this was a situation in the city of Balad, which is right outside Samra. Samra is where you had the Shia mosque in the middle of a Sunni city that was blown up by a guy named Zarqawi in order to really generate the Sunni Shia strife. I only say that because it was a very volatile area when we got there, and it was during the surge in that particular period. So we had a commander who really analyzed the situation out there. This was an agricultural area, and they had not been farming since the beginning of the war, since 2003 timeframe. And they knew that they needed to start farming again. So this commander, without firing a shot, found two wealthy Iraqis, and he developed a relationship with them. And he convinced them to pull their money together and to create a bank. Under Saddam Hussein, there was no such thing as a bank.
Yeah.
Saddam. So what's amazing is he had the skills to develop a trusted interpersonal relationship with these two Iraqis. And they trusted him enough to listen to him. So they pulled their money and they started loaning their money out. And there was this factory that used to make tomatoes or tomato paste that was all dilapidated, wasn't working anymore. And they needed a loan to get the repairs so they can get this thing up and running again. So these two bankers went ahead and gave them the loan. They got the tomato paste factory up and running again. And all of a sudden there was a market now for the farmers to start growing tomatoes, which they hadn't done in about 4 years, 3 or 4 years. So the farmers wanted to start farming, but if you're going to farm in Iraq, you got to get the water out of the Tigris River into the canals, out of the canals into the fields, which means all those canals over 3 years of war were all dilapidated. They had to be repaired. So the farmers put pressure on the local government to repair the canals, to get the silt out of there, get them up and running again. And all of the pumps had to start working, which means you had to get the electrical grid up and running again. The farmers put the pressure on them to do that, and they reacted to it, and they did. So all of a sudden they had all these tomatoes. There was all irrigation. The tomatoes were growing like crazy. They were bringing them to the tomato paste factory, plugging up the highway, and that created entrepreneurial Iraq to plow out the field so that they can have a parking area. And then you had someone that built a couple of snack bars, and someone actually built a small hotel. And all of a sudden the place started booming economically, and the place became one of the most peaceful areas. It was a volatile area, then it became one of the most peaceful areas because of the intellect of this man to understand the natural hierarchy order, where to put pressure, understanding the second, third order effects, and then to have the interpersonal skills to develop relationships without firing a shot. His effectiveness on the battlefield was not a weapon. His effectiveness was his intellect and the agility to be able to recognize opportunity.
Yeah, great story, and one of many you tell in this book, you guys. Second is a strength of the gut. And it's interesting to read, Mike, that the only factor that reliably predicted which cadets would make it through basic training or not was grit. You have done so much work around grit, along with Angela Duckworth. Share with us some of what you've learned.
So an interesting question is, are there particular outcomes or goals for which grit is more or less important? You know? So what you described, West Point's cadet basic training, in just in informal parlance, that's really a gut check. It's like basic military training anywhere with some added stuff thrown in. So in some ways, when a young person who's used to sleeping in prior to coming to West Point, maybe 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and just kind of living the life of a teenager or a young person, meets West Point for the first time, and all of a sudden is getting up at 5 in the morning, and maybe pretty soon we've got them out in the field, and they're cold, or they're a little bit hungry, and they're away from their social network of family and friends. That truly becomes a gut check and doesn't really have much to do with your IQ. So it's that stubborn streak that says, by gosh, I'm going to get through this no matter what.
Yeah.
You know, that really defines what I think grit is mostly about. One thing we've really found interesting about grit, I think this really gets to the heart of our notion of the character edge, as characters being an edge to a blade, which makes you even better, is that even for things for which SAT scores predict really well, like first term freshman, our case plebe, academic performance, if you combine high SAT scores with high grit score, you get a marginal enhancement in success of those young people. So in a sense, it provides that edge. So Angela Duckworth and I and some others recently published an article that looked at 10 years of data among plebes. And we looked at getting through the first summer. We basically replicated that and shown that to be a very valid phenomenon finding that you just described based on 11,000 cadets, not just 1,500. And then we looked at how well they do over the 47 months, how well they do at academics, largely more a head strength, right? As opposed to a gut strength. How well they do at military leadership, and how they do it, physical fitness. And it turns out that over those three things over 47 months, grit plays a greater or lesser amount depending on what you're trying to predict. And then finally, we wanted to know at 47 months, basically 4 years, who's still there, who's still there and graduates. And grit over that entire 47 months was important in hanging in and finishing what you start. I think the moral of the story is twofold. One is that when you're trying to predict human achievement and success, while grit is really, really important, other things are important too. Talent does matter. And strengths of the heart matter, and strengths of the head matter. And the second thing I'd leave you with from your question is, again, this notion that character in general, not just grit, provides that edge, especially among elite performers. You got to be pretty good to get into West Point. You get 1,200 new kids that come every year, and they're all pretty good.
Yeah.
What makes the difference in the long run? And we think that character is a very important piece of that.
Yeah. Speaking about grit, I was thinking about an old BASF commercial. I don't know if you remember them, the German chemical company. Yeah. And they said, we don't make the carpets, we make the carpets stronger. And it just seems like grit, with all those other things that make all those things better when you apply grit to all those other different areas of endeavor. So, well, speaking of early mornings, Bob, I see you've brought that spirit down to South Carolina with your 6 o'clock workout. So I've been following you on Twitter. I know what's going on. But let's talk about strengths of the heart. And that is brought home by your own story, and that of First Lieutenant Daniel Hyde. Could you tell us about him?
Yeah, thanks. It's a tough story. But thanks for the opportunity to tell it, because he's an incredible man. He was. So Dan Hyde, when I was assigned to West Point earlier as the Commandant of Cadets, which is similar to the Dean of Student Affairs, I had done that and I left, then went to combat with Dan Hyde and had another assignment. Then I came back as a superintendent. But I knew Dan Hyde back then as one of the senior leaders of the entire class. He had actually elevated himself one of the top 4 or 5 students in the entire class. Tremendous talent, tremendous young man, so much potential intellectually, physically, anything. Incredible man of character. And for whatever reason, he ended up in the 25th Division, so that when I left West Point at that time, I went to command the 25th Division. And shortly after I got there, the entire division deployed to Iraq. And he happened to be in Samra. He was one of the ones in Samra at the time. So I was with General Odierno, who was the commander, and I got a message that one of our platoons down in Samra was in a pretty tough firefight. And I knew Dan Hyde was down there, and I had always kind of looking after Dan Hyde because I had developed such a close relationship with him. And so they were giving me notes and giving me updates on how the fight was going and stuff like that. And I didn't know if it was Dan's platoon or some of the other platoons. And then I got word it was Dan's platoon, and then I got word that he was killed. And I knew his mom and dad, and it was just tragic. So it's one of those things that really hurts. It hurts you right in the heart. And so I flew down there and just spent some time alone with him afterwards. And you just tell him how sorry you are and how unfortunate. But one thing I always committed to Dan Hyde is that we will never forget Dan, and we will never forget his sacrifice. It's some incredible sacrifice that those men and women have given to our nation and to what our nation is today, and we must never forget their sacrifice and what they have done. So Dan Hyde's very special. I still wear his bracelet so many years later, and the reason I do is because I never want to forget. I never want to forget the sacrifice of those men and women and what they've done for their country.
And you're still in touch with his parents?
I am. I do. Yeah. I am. Matter of fact, I just sent a note on Facebook to his mom just the other day.
Yeah, it's a tough story, and thank you so much for sharing it. I want to go back to this, Mike, if I can. Trust. There's a chapter in the book, Trust, the straw that stirs the drink. And ain't that the case? Through your research, what are the factors that go into building trust? A lot of people don't know how to do that.
Yeah, so let me give credit to a colleague of ours from West Point who's now retired, Patrick Sweeney, Dr. Pat Sweeney, retired. Pat's down at Wake Forest University now in their business school. When Pat was a graduate student, Dave Petraeus, then Major General Petraeus, called and said, hey, you got to get out of graduate school and come help us. We're going to war. This is back in March of, the events leading up to the March of 2003 into Iraq. So what Pat had the sense to do, and the presence of mind do, was to say, hey, I'm in my doctoral program. I'm going to collect data in the field, like while we're actually in combat, on trust. So what I'm going to say about this really I want to give credit to Pat Sweeney and his insightful work on it. Because academics tend to look at trust and a lot of these things in very artificial conditions. They may give surveys to freshmen, or they may survey some arcane sample of workers. And it's just not the same as studying trust in a situation where life or death could occur. And so what Pat has found is that, and we believe, Bob and I believe, this is characteristic of lots of occupations, many of which are, of course, tip of the spear things like law enforcement and fire department, such as that. But there's three components to trust, and they are competence, and we call them the 3 C's. So if you want to be trusted as a platoon leader, or you want to be trusted as a shift sergeant in a police department, or you name the field, you better know the job really well on all the details. So now I wouldn't really expect a platoon leader to ever, probably break out the machine gun in a battle and lead the charge. That's not really there, but they better know what they're doing so they can demonstrate to the soldiers this degree of competence. And the more you can do that, that's a really point towards.
You have to know how the business works, whatever
absolutely.
the business might be. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the second then is character. And as Bob said before, you can be the most competent cadet, but if you fail on character, you fail on leadership. So building character, I would almost argue that the first thing you should do is to assess your own character. We talked about that in chapter 1 of the book, and there's a very nice online survey, which gives really good results, and it's in the book. And so you figure out and become aware of what your 24 character strengths are. I believe there's 24. Scientists believe there's 24. Look at the rank order. What's your top 5 or 6? What's your bottom 5 or 6? And as you build self-awareness, that then allows you to have insight into how to leverage your strengths, now your character strengths, to accomplish difficult goals and to lead others. So I think the neat thing about character, if you look at it as a 24-dimension thing as opposed to a 1-dimension thing, is we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses. So my strengths, being a professor and all the strengths of the head more so. I'm pretty good at self-regulation, and I'm very, for some reason, high on forgiveness. But otherwise, I'm not so strong in some of those other categories. And you, Denver, I mean, if you take this thing, you'll find your own distribution of strengths. Again, the beauty of this strength model is there are different ways to leverage your own strengths to achieve almost any different goal. So you'll find 2 equally trusted leaders who may tend to employ different character strengths in order to achieve that goal. So I think self-awareness is a really important piece of becoming a competent and high character trusted leader. And then nurturing, the 3rd C is caring, true, genuine caring for those who serve with you and under you, so to speak. And that is something that once you're aware of it, there are certain behaviors you can practice. Even it may sound a little artificial, but practice remembering the birthdays, practice stopping to take time each day and talk to people and ask them how they're doing. So there's some things you can do along those lines. And you do all those things together, then I think you're building trust.
Yeah, and I should point out to listeners, there are some character building exercises in the book to follow, and they're really, really very interesting. So, Bob, you recently became president of the University of South Carolina, as I mentioned in the opening, and that can be a difficult transition, especially for someone coming, let's say, not out of the traditional world of higher ed, but it's gone very, very well. What have you done, and some of the things that you've endeavored to do to earn the trust of that community? What does a new leader need to do in a community to earn trust?
Well, thanks, Dever. You're absolutely correct. So as an outsider to the traditionalist for presidents of higher education, although come as a president of West Point and not coming up in a career path in that particular manner, that did raise some skepticism, and I recognize all of that. So I do recognize that this was an issue of trust, and it's trust that has to be earned. Trust doesn't happen automatically. You really have to earn it. And the first thing that I did is to try to build as many bridges, interpersonal relations, engage with people, knock down whatever walls were out there, and listen. And listen. And so the first group I met with were students that were concerned about me coming there. So I met with them right up front. And then I met with faculty members. I met with all the trustees one-on-one. There were some trustees that were in favor of me coming, some not. And it was just an issue of building relationships and building trust as a result of that. And then there were other constituents that are out there as well. We're the flagship university 1 block away from the State House, which means we have legislative issues and political issues all the time. So I really realized how important it was to develop relationships with the legislators. And then we had to develop relationships, since we're an urban campus right smack in the middle of the city of Columbia, where 80% of our students live off campus in the community, that we had to really develop relationships with those neighborhoods, because students like to have social gatherings at all hours of the day and night, as you can imagine. So we had
I can remember.
yeah. So it's important to build those relationships, but trust is the heart of it all, and that is to build that trust relationship. Furthermore, as a public actor, this is a public institution, and even those in the military are also in a public institution, the United States Profession of Arms, that our client in this endeavor is those whom we serve. It's the people of South Carolina in my capacity as a flagship. And in the United States Military Academy, United States Military, it's the people of the United States of America. And if in this profession, whether it's a profession of arms or of higher education, your client are those people, and as a public actor, as a public servant, you have to develop a relationship with them. And that relationship has got to be strong, and it's got to be built on something. And the best way to get a strong relationship is to build it on trust.
Yeah.
And trust, like Mike said, is a function of not only your competence, but it's also of your character and also of caring. And when you demonstrate caring and character and competence to those constituents out there, the natural thing that will emerge out of that is trust.
Yeah.
And once you have trust established, you can lose it. But once you have trust established, it's important to nurture it and to maintain it and to continue it to grow, because otherwise it'll naturally atrophy.
And Bob, so far we've been talking about individuals, but there are also high character organizations. I know one would be Johnson & Johnson, led by a West Point alum, of course, who live by a credo every single day. Tell us about that, Bob, and the hallmarks of a high character organization.
Yeah, no, it was really a pleasure to interview the presidency of Johnson & Johnson and to hear him talk about the creed. And frankly, that creed was put in place when Johnson & Johnson was established way back in the early 1900s. Kept it. And Alex Gorski is the president and CEO. And Alex actually understands the creed not only as a set of values to aspire to, but also to develop the current leaders and the future leaders of the institution. That's an important point. The point is that you just can't assume people are just going to embrace the values. It's a developmental process. And so he has regular sessions, and he sits down and talks to the first reports that report to him, and he evaluates them on the creed and the values within the creed. And he sits down and talks to them on a regular basis on what's strong, what's not only as an individual, but the role the individual plays for the institution. And you remember way back, I think it was in the 1980s or 90s when they had the Tylenol incident.
Oh, yeah.
But it was really interesting to see how Johnson & Johnson had reacted to that in transparency in order to regain the trust of the public, the constituents of that, because they could have easily lost all trust and then the whole place would have fallen in. But it's really a great lesson, and see how they had to, through transparency and communication, demonstrate their competence, how they were handling this, and then what they needed to do to regain the trust of their constituents. And they did.
Yeah, and picking up on that, Mike, you draw a distinction in the book about losing trust between the Catholic Church and how they responded, and GoFundMe and how they responded. Tell us what that story is.
I think in almost every case, when you look at organizations that do well in the face of a crisis versus those who don't do so well, you just look at it from the lens of competence, character, and caring, you can differentiate between those two. And so GoFundMe site, this is just a quick summary of this. There was a husband and wife who conspired with a veteran to defraud them. So people would give money to GoFundMe, and they walked away with a lot of money and bought shiny cars.
Yeah, tons of media coverage of that story.
Yeah, and it's all over the place. Yeah. And so rather than deny it or avoid it or stick their heads in the sand, what the GoFundMe people did is they said, look, we know how to fix this. We're going to take future actions to demonstrate competence. Here's a plan that's going to address this to keep this from happening again. We implement new security checks into the system and so forth, establishing competence. They showed character by not, frankly, lying about or denying it.
Yeah.
And they showed caring by the fact that their whole setup is to help others, those who are in need. The whole company's about caring. So they had all these 3 C's in place. Now, the Catholic Church has a lot going for it, like a couple of thousand years of history of doing great stuff. And so they've hit this rough patch with, and I don't want to diminish that because there's evidence to suggest that in the American population, at least based on opinion polls, confidence in the Catholic Church has been eroding sort of at the same time these sex abuse scandals broke. But you could easily walk away with the impression through the years that the church would deny it was happening on a large scale. It was just a bad actor, a bad person in Picker Parish. And then you read about people who've been accused, priests who've been accused of this, being just given another job someplace and no real consequence. And so Catholics and others who are looking at them may begin to question the competence of the church and their approach to dealing with the problem, their character, and being honest about it.
Yeah.
If you really cared about your parishioners and the church, wouldn't you try to fix that pretty major problem?
Absolutely.
The good news is religion plays such an important role in people's lives, and it's a character boosting thing. If they've got a good basis to rebound from by reestablishing competence and how they go about dealing with this, demonstrating character now, positive character in dealing with the situation, and then as much caring as they can heap upon those would be quite helpful.
Yeah. And have you seen instances, Bob, when a leader's failure of character has not only affected him or her, but the entire organization and its ability to complete the task it's been assigned to do?
Absolutely. I see it all the time. And that's one of the consequences of failure in character, because it not only affects the individual, but it affects the entire organization. So in the preface of the book, I tell the story of one of my battalions up in Mosul, one of the hottest places in all of Iraq, and they lost their commander, who was beloved, man of great competence and character. And it really had an impact on the leaders and throughout the entire battalion. We quickly got another commander and put him in there, a very competent commander, but he had some other character issues, and as a result, we had to remove him. So within a period of just a couple months, they had gone through 2 commanders, one who was a man of great integrity in character and competence, and one who was not. And the competence of the unit, particularly in combat, was hugely affected. And so I had some great concerns, and there had to be some retraining that was going on among leaders and among smaller organizations within the big organization. If I had the ability to pull the entire battalion out of combat and then retrain them with leadership and then put them back in again, I would have. You just physically can't do that. But character, you're exactly right, does not just affect the individual and the consequences to him or her, it affects the entire organization that they're in charge of.
Yeah. And then even after you replace that person, that damage can still linger as the next person comes in. It just doesn't magically go away, does it?
No, it doesn't. With a person with great character, they can really turn the thing around. And they can do so quickly, but they always have that other thing that's lingering around from before.
Yeah. Finally, gentlemen, I don't believe anybody would dispute, at least anyone who has a TV, that there is a crisis of character in this country. There's a breakdown to trust in virtually all our institutions, and I think now we are not even beginning to trust our fellow citizens. Maybe you could each say a final word about that, the contribution you hope this book will make in bringing character-driven leadership to the public at large, and what winning the right way means. Let me start with you, Mike.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the one point I'd like to get across is that I've been studying as a scientist. I've been looking at character for almost 40 years. And when I first started looking at it, I looked at character as something that was pretty much something inside of you. You as an individual are honest, or you have self-regulation, or you have grit, or you have kindness, or whatever it may be. And the more and more and more that I study it, and the more I've worked with people like Bob Caslen who've lived that life of leadership in demanding situations, the more I'm coming to understand that character, that the organization itself may be more important than what's inside of you in bringing out the good or the bad in a person. So when I see the situation today, and every day you open up one of your preferred news media sources, and there's the crisis of the day, and this politician said that, or that politician said something else, and you don't know what to believe. It does erode trust because it's violating that competence. We should all be evaluating, or for people we're going to vote for, competence, character, and caring. Now, we all have different lenses, right? So I resist the temptation to point a finger at a given individual and say, well, it's so-and-so's fault as a leader, this problem. At the end of the day, in a democracy, It's we, the people, who elect our leaders. So I think that just my one reaction, I'll kind of leave with that, so everyone hear what Bob's got to say, is we have to look ourselves in the face about who we choose to lead us at the national, even the local level. So I think we need to share the blame, if blame is to be assessed, and in successful case, share the success stories as well when we get good people in. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I think there's far too few mirrors around and far too many fingers pointing. No question about it. And that's exactly where we're at. And, you know, I had a behavioral scientist on the show the other day, and they were talking about decision making, and they talked about the person and the individual. He said the breakdown is the opposite of what we would think. It's 30% on the individual and 70% on the environment that they're in. And that is just the opposite of what most people think. So the culture and the organization and the environment, to your point, Mike, plays a profound role.
Yeah, if you see an organization that wins consistently, like I've done some work, just informal consulting, the San Antonio Spurs, they've been good for a quarter century.
Yeah.
That's not happenstance.
No.
They have a very healthy, robust, positive culture. On the other hand, you fill in the blank, NBA fans, another team who consistently fails year in, year out. There's probably something going on at the organizational level. And so I always coming more and more just to look at the organization first and foremost, maybe 70% of the time, and then put that other 30% on the individual.
I think you're absolutely right. And Bob, your thoughts?
Well, I would say that you're right. Whenever you point your finger at somebody, there's three fingers pointing back at you. So don't forget about
Right.
those three. You know, our country's seen worse times and worse divides, and they've come through it. So I feel confident our country will again. That means to say that we are in the middle of a divide right now. I think there's a couple of contributing factors to this. I think, thank God for the increase in technology, but social media has really kind of put a whole different dimension on that. And it's what Marty Dempsey wrote a book, and in chapter 1, he called it the digital echo, that you can say something on social media and it can go viral. And it doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is how many likes you get. So the whole essence of what is important now is not necessarily facts and truth, but likes. And it kind of distorts reality out there. So I think we at some particular point got to take a look at social media and how to get that back into the box from a character perspective, because it destroys trust, and that's what happens. So if we're in this divide right now, and I just think the divide, as I look at all different aspects of it, is just selfish. We're looking at ourselves. I'd love to see a leader who is not necessarily humble, but is selfless, that looks at selfless service, that wants to serve the people of the country, that wants to serve the people of their state and wherever they're being running for office from. And selfless service is one of the values of our Army, and it's one of the values that we talk about from a character perspective as well. A good example of a very divided nation and having a leader come together to unify it was Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
All people in South Africa. It's a great story in itself. So Nelson Mandela is thrown in prison for X amount of years, I forget.
27, I think it was.
Yeah. So what does he do when he comes out of prison? Rather than be resentful, he forgives those who put him in prison. And the forgiveness that he demonstrated was powerful. It created empathy. And when you create empathy, you find common ground. And when you can find common ground, then rather than pointing fingers at each other, you find common ground that you can latch onto together. And then you can move forward together.
Yeah.
But it really started with a leader who demonstrated humility and forgiveness. And by demonstrating humility and forgiveness, two very powerful values. And then that brought the country together so that they can move forward. And he ended up being a powerful leader and a very effective leader in unifying that nation. We need to find Nelson Mandela here in the United States, for sure.
That's for sure. Well, as they say, radical change, one of the keys to it is to forgive your enemies, because you're going to need them. There's no question about it. The book, again, is The Character Edge, Leading and Winning with Integrity. If we can address this issue, it will allow us to successfully tackle so many of our other challenges, and you'll find this book to be the perfect field guide for that. I can't thank you both enough for being here. It was a real delight to have you on the program.
Thank you very much, Denver. We enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir.